We rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise, in hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In a hope, in prayer, we're right here. In a hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise. All of the children rise. Elders with wisdom rise. Ancestors surround us rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In a hope, in prayer, we're right here. In a hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise up from the wreckage. Rise with tears and with courage. Rise, fighting for life. We rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided rise, with spirit to guide us rise.
I want to invite you to settle into wherever you are for a moment, to let your body relax, to feel the weight of yourself, to feel the presence of yourself. And as you feel yourself relaxing, I want to invite you to imagine the world that you want to live in. And in particular, imagine one aspect of the beauty of that world that you want to live in. Picture that beauty as clearly and specifically as you can. What is this world you long to live in like? And as you're picturing that and feeling what it feels like, listen to this poem by Alfred Lamott called Election. I voted. I voted for the rainbow. I voted for the cry of a loon. I voted for my grandfather's bones that feed beetles now. I voted for a singing brook that sparkles under a North Dakota bean field. I voted for salty air through which the whimbrel flies south along the shores of two continents. I voted for melting snow that returns to the wellspring of darkness, where the sky is born from the earth. I voted for demonic mushrooms in the loam and the old democracy of worms. I voted for the wordless treaty that cannot be broken by white man or brown because it is made of star semen, thistle sap, hieroglyphs of the weevil in prairie oak. I voted for the local, the small, the brim that does not spill over, the abolition of waste, the luxury of enough. I voted for the commonwealth of the ancient forest, a larva for every beak, a wing-tinted flower for every moth's disguise, a well-fed mammal's corpse for every colony of maggots. I voted for open borders between death and birth. I voted on the ballot of a fallen leaf of sycamore that cannot be erased, for it becomes the dust and rain and then a tree again. I voted for more fallow time to cultivate wildflowers, more recess in schools to cultivate play, more leisure, tax-free, more space between days. I voted to increase the profit of evening silence and the price of a thrush song. I voted for 10 million stars in your next inhalation. So I invite you to bring your attention back to the screen, along with your wishes for the strength of your vote, and to join us in this conversation. Jim Antal, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our guest and to facilitate the conversation.
Martin, thank you so much for that. And thank God that we still have the opportunity to vote. That's maybe my best introduction to this conversation. As our country's midterms and are less than 100 days away, Third Act Faith invites you to reflect on how our spiritual commitments influence our voting patterns. We've scheduled a series of speakers to shed some light on this challenging question, and I'm pleased to welcome the Reverend Adam Russell Taylor as our first conversation partner. Reverend Taylor is president of Sojourners and author of A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building the beloved community. He is ordained in the American Baptist Church and the Progressive National Baptist Convention and serves in ministry at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Before accepting the call to lead Sojourners, he led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as vice president in charge of advocacy at World Vision US. Reverend Taylor is a progressive Christian. He regularly speaks and writes on topics including voting rights, climate justice, and the ongoing moral and political challenges that are currently impacting every American every day. Whatever may be your spiritual orientation, I'm confident you will welcome the wisdom of Reverend Taylor's insights. Adam and I first met almost 10 years ago when we were part of a group of faith activists from across the nation who came together during Trump's first year in office to share insights, develop strategies, and reinforce our common commitment to the beloved community. Thank you, Adam, for all that you do and for taking time for today's conversation. And a word for our audience, Adam will be responding to your questions after he and I have talked for a while. Please post your questions in the chat. So Adam, on to my first question. Recognizing that Third Act Faith is an interreligious body and includes people affiliated with almost every faith tradition, as well as people who identify as spiritual and not religious, share with us the core teachings from your tradition as a Christian that underscore the importance of voting.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Well, first, thanks for the invitation and grateful to be with all of you, at least virtually. Hopefully, get the chance to meet many of you in person at some point in the future. Really grateful this group exists. Third Act Faith is really important, and I'm grateful that you're finding ways to combine faith and activism well into your, complete life, right? I think that's extremely important. So in terms of how I understand voting from my Christian faith, I really start with Genesis 1 and the kind of core understanding and belief, which is not just a Christian belief, it's also common in the Jewish tradition and in some cases in the Muslim tradition as well. But the core belief of Imago Dei, that we are made in the image and likeness of God. And I think it's easy just to say that without understanding the profound meaning of that. That when I'm looking at you, Jim, I am seeing a reflection of God's image. I mean, that's really powerful. That's really, really important, right? And that also means that we have inherent dignity and worth that God has bestowed upon us. And, with all of the imperfections and flaws of our democratic system, and we can get into more of that as we get into this conversation, I think at its core, I think we could probably all agree that you can't have a functioning and healthy democracy if there aren't fair and free elections. That elections are kind of the cornerstone of democracies. They're not the only thing. Obviously, there's lots of different variations of democracy, parliamentary systems, multi-party systems, etc. But one of the common threads that ties democracies together is that they conduct periodic elections that enable people to elect their representatives, right? And it is not coincidental that voting and the right to vote, access to the vote, has been one of the biggest wedge issues in our nation's history. It has been contested all the way since the beginning of our country. We know that we are in the middle of a semi-quincentennial 250th birthday. We can talk more about that too. I really feel like, unfortunately, this 250th birthday is being overshadowed by one of the most serious and grave assaults we have seen on our democracy since our nation's inception. And it certainly mirrors and echoes many of the struggles that came before us to try to expand the right to vote. But, let's remember that when our nation was founded over 250 years ago, that voting was restricted to white land-owning men. So women could not vote, clearly slaves could not vote, and even white men that did not own land could not vote, right? And ever since, there has been an ongoing struggle to expand the suffrage to include more and more Americans and ultimately get us to a place where the kind of promise of democracy is extended and becomes real for all Americans. And obviously, those struggles took place through the women's suffrage movement, many of whom were inspired by their faith. It took place, obviously, through the civil rights movement, also inspired by faith, multi-faith movement, but very much anchored in the Black church. And really, the crowning achievement, or at least one of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement, was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which then made real the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendment that ultimately, promised the right to vote, but you needed a bill to actually make that real and force the enforcement of that. And so, one of the things that I've been reflecting on is that, I kind of grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement and became very infatuated with the movement and kind of understood that, particularly from my parents, and my mother's black, my father's white. They actually got married in 68, just a year after interracial marriage was legalized in this country. And they, kind of instilled in me a really strong belief that my generation inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights movement. So I quickly learned that, certainly a major part of that struggle was going to be the fight against poverty and the fight for economic justice. And certainly that's what King was doing before he was assassinated, organizing the Poor People's Campaign. It was also going to be about ending mass incarceration and police brutality. And certainly that's been a more recent emphasis. But I admit, I really did not think that voting and voting rights would be an essential part of that agenda, right? Maybe I was naive, maybe I was overly optimistic. But here we are 50 plus years later, and we are seeing ourselves in the throes of another struggle over voting rights. And, we'll get into more of the details hopefully later. But let me just emphasize a couple more things in terms of theology and my kind of core Christian belief. So, you know, I think voting is really critical because it is our voice, it is our agency. It is how at least in part, we can hold leaders accountable and replace leaders that aren't representing our values and at worst are abusing their power. Again, it's not a perfect instrument, but it is arguably the most powerful nonviolent tool we have. And those are the words of Congressman John Lewis. He said that just before he passed on. It's also a really critical way that we help to advance the common good and that we can protect human dignity. It's a really critical way that we can protect the most vulnerable. And I think we can disagree about a lot of things about Scripture, but there is an overriding commitment from the Old Testament prophets all the way through Jesus that we have a mandate from God to show a particular concern for the modern day orphans, widows, strangers, and people living in poverty, right? That is biblical, deeply biblical. And so I think, when we think about how we vote and we think of the importance of voting, it is a critical way that we do that. Not the only way, of course, but a critical way we do that. And then lastly, I would just say that, you know, I really well, I can be I try to be empathetic to people that either, feel like they don't want to vote because they feel like they're having to choose between the worst of two evils, or they feel like the system is just so broken. And while there's some truth to that, I really push back hard by really emphasizing that your decision to opt out of our political system by not voting is essentially a decision to endorse the status quo. And I'm not saying that to shame people or to guilt them, but it's just a reality that if you do not participate, you are giving license to people that are going to be elected that could do very, very harmful things like we're seeing right now. And that decision is going to have, I would argue, a really profound impact on your life, on the lives of the people you care about. And you may not always see it right away. But ultimately, decisions that happen from the local level all the way up to the federal level have a ripple effect on our lives in all kinds of ways that we can get into. So anyway, let me just pause there, but that's a little bit of the scaffolding of why I think it's important to vote.
Oh, it's a great scaffolding, and your comments remind me of what your predecessor Jim Wallace wrote in his book The False White Gospel, when he said the battle over voting rights going on right now in America will determine every other issue we care about. And my guess is you agree with that, and the weave that you just provided shows how voting is connected with those fundamental, and they're not just Christian values. They're values of anybody who would, identify as spiritual. And anything to build on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great quote from Jim, and I do agree with it. I will say this. I mean, I think we have to be a little careful, particularly now, in emphasizing that voting is a strategy and a tool, but it's not the only one. So, sometimes people can kind of hear us overstate the case by saying, if we just vote, everything is going to be okay, everything's going to work out. And obviously that is not not always the case. Often isn't the case because it requires a lot more than voting. But, voting plus is the key, right? I'll emphasize that. I would just say that, I particularly when I wrote my second book, you mentioned it, A More Perfect Union, a new vision for building a beloved community. I really wanted to recast and reimagine the moral vision that animated the civil rights movement, and that was the vision of the beloved community. It's a vision that Dr. King cited and pointed to, but also Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others. And I can share more about kind of how I unpack in the book. But one of the things that I really researched is kind of how different faith traditions understand justice and how they understand the creation of the beloved community. And they don't necessarily have to use those words, but essentially, the creation of a community in which everyone's dignity is protected, where our diversity is seen as a strength and not a weakness, where everyone is respected and equally valued, and where everyone can thrive is just kind of the it's not simple to achieve, but the simple to to explain version of it. And I really got into better understanding the Jewish understanding of Tikkun Olam, what it means to repair and heal the world. I really got into how in Islam there's such a strong emphasis on our responsibilities to and for one another, and kind of a very strong commitment to justice and to compassion in the Quran. And so, in humanist traditions, I mean, huge emphasis on how we care for one another, right? And so I think these are kind of very much common threads that tie together our religions, our spirituality, and we need to tap into that right now because sadly, tragically, there is a MAGA movement that is being supercharged by a white Christian nationalist movement that is hijacking the Christian faith in particular, is wing the Christian faith, distorting it in ways that are extremely harmful, both to our democracy, but also to the very witness of the Christian faith itself. And I'm a Baptist minister. I mean, I care deeply about the Great Commission. I care deeply about sharing the good news of Jesus. And one of the things I should have emphasized as well, like first and foremost, I really believe that God is love. God is perfect love. And God desires and calls us to model and embody that kind of love that not only loves our neighbors, yes, that is the golden rule, but also loves our enemies. And that is extremely hard in this kind of polarized moment that we're in, but is extremely important because we've got to resist this kind of us versus them zero sum mentality that is very much on display, and has kind of taken over a lot of our cultural conversation, let alone our political one because of the Trump administration.
Yeah. And we'll come back to Christian nationalism in a minute and build on what you just said. But before we do, one of the questions that many in our coordinating committee had has to do with the silence of pulpits and congregations around both the crisis of our democracy that we're in the midst of, but also around the climate crisis. Catherine Hayhoe, among others, is now referring to climate hushing.
Hmm.
And Naomi Oreskes up at Harvard in the History of Science department has done a survey of how much in sermons that are recorded, so you can do an AI analysis of what gets said in those sermons. How frequently is climate change or any kind of related word used? And it's mind-blowingly almost never. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts about how we might energize progressive churches and mainline churches and other faith communions to recognize the importance of what happened, in the late 50s and 60s among all black congregations, or almost all black congregations, in relation to voting rights. How we might elevate the concerns about both democracy and climate. Any any ideas?
It is a great question. I wish I had a magic bullet, to be honest. There is definitely no panacea for this challenge, this quandary that we're in. But I do think that there are some things we can certainly do. So first, I think in part we have gotten it so wrong and we are so stuck. And I'm obviously talking in broad generalities. There are big exceptions to this,
Yeah.
but majority of churches, you're right, are not preaching from the pulpit about the climate crisis. And some of that I think is a real theological um, issue of essentially theological malpractice. So many churches, particularly more conservative leaning ones, but you can find it in mainline Protestant congregations as well as Catholic and others, have overemphasized essentially Genesis 1:28 that describes how we are called to control the earth. Although I think that is a real misreading of Genesis, because what Genesis actually emphasizes is that we are called to serve and protect the earth. It uses two Hebrew words, avad and shamar, and that we are called to be caretakers of the earth, right? Very different set of responsibilities than dominion and control and even abuse of the earth. And unfortunately, either because more of a stewardship perspective hasn't been preached effectively and compellingly in many churches, or just hasn't been preached at all, this kind of dominionist attitude is seeped into the consciousness of a lot of Christians, whether they recognize it or not. And then if they're hearing from their politicians, particularly if they're more conservative or Republican, or in some cases Democrats as well, that the climate crisis isn't real or it's not really a priority, that it's not going to have immediate impacts or there's not much we can do about it. It creates this kind of easy permission structure just to turn a blind eye and to look the other way. And the good news is there are major exceptions to this. Interfaith Power and Light has done a lot of good work to try to get churches engaged and
Yep.
really show churches how they can, literally green their congregations, which is also just a really important contribution. The Pope's encyclical, the previous Pope, Pope Francis, in 2015, the Laudato Si, was incredible, right? And I say this jokingly, but I almost feel like it had more impact beyond Catholic churches than Catholic churches, because he was speaking to the world and, just really made such a strong, passionate theological, moral case, coinciding with a scientific and political case for why we need to take this crisis seriously and why it's not just an existential crisis, but it's also a deeply spiritual crisis. And so, I do feel like there's been a kind of retrenchment, and that really breaks my heart, particularly as I think about, let's make this more personal. I mean, my kids are 15 and 13, and it's really their future and their
Right.
potential kids' future, my potential grandchildren's future that is most at stake. And we are on a collision course because of our addiction to carbon, because of our greed, because of our overconsumption. And yet, and this is, I guess, is the good news, we have increasingly good solutions in terms of renewable energy and the degree to which renewable energy has become very, very competitive and very, very cost effective. And so, in some ways, it's almost like the power of economics is outpacing our moral response to this crisis. And, I wish that wasn't the case, but I do think there's a way to catch up. And I do think that, as we even experience some of the current more visible manifestations of this climate crisis, literally with hurricanes and floods that are happening right now in the South and the Midwest. And, we had horrific smoke that came down from all the wildfires in the Rockies. My kids had a track meet the weekend of July 4th and could barely run outside. They actually should have canceled the meet because the
Yeah.
air
Yeah.
air quality was so bad. And so I hope some of those are kind of like wake up calls for people and for churches. But I think we have to do some of that meaning making with people to really help them understand these are not just isolated events. There are root causes to this, and there are also real solutions that we can take on together. And, there are things that you can do individually, and there's some things that we need to call our politicians to do. Um, so yeah, I mean, I am hopeful because there are certainly some states that have bucked the trend of the federal government and are actually doing quite good. There are countries, obviously, across Europe and elsewhere that have also decided to just lead despite the intransigence and, in some ways, like blocking of the United States. But ultimately, I believe we can push our country onto a different trajectory. And, we have to do that. But in the meantime, we've got to start local and at the state level to try to make as much progress as
Yeah.
we can.
One of the core values, not just of our Christian tradition, but of every religious tradition, is the importance of truth. And Americans, what part of what's keeping Americans from utilizing their faith as a lever to reverse the disinformation and the distrust and the alternative facts. Part of what's keeping them from doing that is this atmosphere of fake, well, what I would call fake news and disinformation and everything. And God knows, and I think Sojourners has emphasized this recently, that artificial intelligence is just going to make it all so much worse. Um, Tell us how Sojourners magazine and your community have sought out this commitment to truth, which is so fundamental to our tradition.
Yeah, I mean, we believe deeply in the importance of truth. We certainly take that in part because of what Jesus said that, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So when we are captive to lies, it is a real form of captivity. And, sadly, we are seeing the pervasiveness of lies all across our culture and in our politics. It used to be disqualifying if a politician just blatantly lied about important things. And yet, we know the current president is a pathological liar, and that doesn't get checked enough, it doesn't get called out enough, or at least not enough on the kind of right and among his supporters. And just, doesn't seem to matter for a lot of them. Right? And so I don't fully understand it, I admit. I understand like the kind of fractured information ecosystems that people are living in. And I understand the
Yeah,
degree of distrust toward institutions, including the media. So I know there are certainly, long-standing reasons why many people have come to distrust and doubt many media sources, including mainstream media. But I'm definitely not fatalistic about it because I do believe that when you're able to engage in conversation with people that you actually have some relationship with, that you can kind of talk through issues outside of sound bites and outside of just facts. And it's hard, I'll admit, like this part is hard for me because, I love facts. I love statistics. I have a master's in public policy, so certainly that is one of the places that I look for truth. And what I've come to realize is that unfortunately, facts don't win the argument. If you try to start with facts and end with facts, most likely those facts are just going to bounce off the preconceived notions that are already in someone's head. They call this confirmation bias. And
right.
so, we've got to find a way to be able to speak to people's core values, speak
Mm,
to their aspirations, speak to the things that they're really concerned about. There's usually an underlying reason why they might be buying into a false narrative or a false set of or false facts, if you will. Um, and so, I think it's really important that we do some of that deeper conversational and dialogue work, which I know requires a little bit more patience. And I mean, I do think that we need more courage. Some of it is people in positions of authority, of power, of moral authority in many cases have been not all, but there has been not been enough truth telling, which I think is a core part of our tradition. I mean, this is what the prophets modeled day in and day out,
indeed.
right? From Amos to Ezekiel to
Right.
Isaiah, right? And they did it in a way, yes, that would often condemn the idolatry and injustice of religious leaders and of rulers and kings. But they wouldn't just end at doom. They would always point to hope. They would point to what it would take to lead to liberation and restoration. And so, I think that's the other piece of this is like we can't just, end with all the bad. We also have to point to the hopeful alternative vision that we're trying to co-create together. I'll just end with this. I mean, the example of this that has been most exasperating for me has been the big lie of widespread voter fraud that certainly Trump has doubled down on. It's what he used to argue the 2020 election was stolen. Obviously, he took that lie to court and it got shot down by judges at every level across the country. And it still astounds me that, that lie is still so pervasive, particularly among Republicans and particularly among the right. And what I've come to realize is like, one, I'm not even sure as many people that say they believe it actually believe it. It is being used as a pretense
Yes.
to hold on to power. And that, because, yes, it's been kind of stoked and manufactured, but it's also a political strategy to
Right.
try to create fear and confusion and distrust of our electoral system so that the president can then justify doing disruptive things like trying to
Yeah.
pass a SAVE Act and potentially even do really destructive things like deny election results that don't go his way and favor his party come November. So when you understand that kind of broader strategy, then it makes me at least better understand like why so many people are holding on to this lie, whether
Right.
they actually believe it's true or not. And I think it makes it that much more important that not only do we communicate really strongly that no, actually our election system is not perfect, but it is quite safe. There has not been foreign interference that has actually changed any votes in our election. No, actually, the real heroes in our election are election officials, and they are nonpartisan, and they do the work of counting votes and making sure that that process goes smoothly. And when you do that kind of messaging, and when you also just talked about, what this president really is doing is a desperate attempt to hold on to power at all costs. He is trying to tilt the system in his favor. And most Americans, I believe, still believe in fairness and don't want to see a president or a party essentially rig the system to win. And so, it just violates those basic tenets of fairness.
Everything you've said, I was just listening to you really carefully, and everything you were saying about voting and about holding on to democracy, and about the misrepresentations and so forth. It's all true about climate change as well. It's
Yeah.
all and of course, the president is one of the lead voices, but so are the CEOs of all of the oil and gas companies. And the parallels are really mind-blowingly astonishing, which is why Third Act has linked our commitment around climate to our commitment around fighting authoritarianism. Um, and why at least we in Third Act Faith think that congregations, whatever faith they may be, congregations can and should be focused on both of these issues, on the interrelationship of these issues, and on the role, as you were just saying, that truth and facts play in relation both to the onslaught of autocracy and the denialism that's allowing, oil and gas to just expand and take over things.
Yeah.
Um,
Just real quick, I'm really glad you said that. And just I want to put a finer point on it. So,
please.
many of you are probably familiar with called what many are referring to as the authoritarian playbook. So these are kind of the core tactics that authoritarian leaders are using all around the world. And certainly we're seeing them, very evident within the Trump administration. And one of those core tactics is to attack the press and media and ultimately try to control it. And another one is to try to bend truth to the will of the leader, or get people to be so flooded with disinformation that people kind of throw up their hands and just don't know what is true, right? And
Yeah.
what's not. And so, one of the things that truth and facts can do in a healthy political system that isn't as polarized as ours is it can serve as a referee. Because at least if you have a trusted source that can kind of call balls and strikes, and then, and we used to see this, if you remember many, many years ago in some of our debates when you would trust some of the mainstream media sources to kind of do some of that fact checking, sometimes in real time. And most Americans would trust what they're doing because they were doing it with integrity. I think we can get back to something like that. It's going to take, some real effort, and it's going to take definitely some significant change, particularly with Trump, but also others around him. But but yeah, I just want to kind of mention that because I do think that there's this kind of role that truth and fact checking and facts can play that's really, really crucial for a healthy democracy. And so I'm not at a point where I don't think we're beyond a point of no return, that we could get back to something along those lines.
And I want to draw you out because you're obviously so enamored isn't the right word. You're just so driven by your decades long connection with facts, fact checking, and truth. Say a little more about how fundamental the role of truth and facts is in congregations, in worship communities.
Right. Well, so one of the things that facts and truth enable us to do is they enable us to resist the seduction of extreme ideology. Because an ideology can say there's only one path to achieve a certain end, right? Or there's only one approach or set of policies. And we have to be more disciplined in that. Like we all certainly have our ideological leanings, and that is fine. But I think one of the things that is dangerous is when, you allow yourself to basically succumb to one ideological framework and that becomes kind of more important to you than facts that may contradict it, right? So, I'll give you an example. It drives me absolutely crazy with moral indignation that as a nation, at least federally, we still have a minimum wage that's at 7.25 an hour. I mean, it is absolutely shameful. It's pitiful. No one can really work full time at 7.25 and not be stuck in poverty. There are obviously many municipalities and states that have increased it significantly, and I applaud them. But the challenge is that's not across the board. And
Right.
what we really need is, I mean, a kind of a living wage of at least $22 an hour. Many
Right.
economists put it even higher. So this is why facts are important, because if you're coming at this from a purely ideological perspective, then, well, let me back up. Polls show that almost all Americans believe that if you work full time in this nation, you should not be poor. It's just kind of
Right.
a core belief, tied into the work ethic of Americans, etc. And yet we know because of this woefully inadequate minimum wage, a lot of people are. And so what you get then is many that take an ideological approach where they oppose increasing the minimum wage because they argue that it is going to hurt jobs and that corporations and small businesses are going to eliminate jobs in the process. Well, we can test that. We have seen localities that have increased the minimum wage significantly. We have seen states that have done it, right? And we compare it to states that haven't and cities that haven't. And we have a lot of evidence that shows that no, in fact, it does not have that kind of deleterious effect on jobs, right? And so, again, like let let's look to facts to and like evidence to really guide some of our decisions because in this case, like we can actually get to a shared goal in principle if we were able to be guided and governed by that rather than by ideology. And I'm just mentioning that because I think there's actually ways in which that shows up in a lot of our arguments on a whole range of issues across our communities. And it's one of the reasons why it's so hard to have some of those conversations in churches where you think it would be one of the first places that people could come together, engage in civil dialogue, find common ground, and be able to kind of work through some of their differences. And of course, that does happen, but not nearly enough. And we have seen how our churches are also self-segregating across ideology and party like the rest of the country is. And so there's fewer and fewer churches where you really have a real mixture of folks that are coming from different political perspectives. And if you do, usually the kind of truce that's put in place is, well, we're just not going to talk about politics, right?
Exactly.
Like we just become apolitical. But then it's like, well, shouldn't we this be the place where we could actually have healthier dialogue about hard issues
Well,
and
and
to
if you
figure
read
out
the prophets, you realize, hello.
yeah, no, that's right. That's right. Sojourners has a program called Bridging Divides, where we're really trying to equip pastors and churches on how to engage in some of these harder conversations, rooted in core biblical principles. And so, for anyone that's interested, we could get you connected to that curriculum and to those resources. But, you know, I'm not trying to I'm not naive. I know this can be really hard work and it comes with risks. But
Right.
I believe this is the work of reconciliation. This is the work that we're called to as Christians and as people from other faith traditions as well. And if we don't better equip and harness our congregations to do this work, it's not happening in many other places. And so I feel like it could
Yeah.
be a really powerful vehicle that we really are taking for granted right now.
It's my impression, and tell me what your impression is that that mainline and progressive congregations of whatever faith perspective have been slow to recognize the significance, to the point you were just making about ideology, the significance of Christian nationalism and its rising influence. And I'm just wondering if you have any experience with or any suggestions for people who are members in such congregations or maybe clergy who are leaders in such congregations as to what role they might play in resisting Christian nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that kind of resurgence of Christian nationalism is a real failure of Christian discipleship and of civic education in this country. It's kind of a combination of both. And it's pretty important to remember that we have had other mutations of Christian nationalism throughout our nation's history. I mean, arguably the most virulent version was the Ku Klux Klan, was a
Right.
white Christian nationalist organization, right? Um, in the present context, part of what makes addressing and combating Christian nationalism challenging is it really is, and I'm getting this in part from a guy named Sam Whitehead and Philip Gorski are two sociologists, and they've done a lot of kind of good scholarship work around Christian nationalism, and they really describe it as a combination of being an identity, a strategy, and an ideology. That it's really these three things combined, and it's more of a continuum than it is a hard and fast binary, right? So I cover some of this in my book when I talk about the myths that America was based on, and I'm actually borrowing that from Richard Hughes, who wrote a book called The Myths America Lives By. And what he argued is that there are some really core myths that are woven into the DNA of our nation's consciousness, right? So there's this myth that we are a chosen nation, very much derived all the way back to the Puritans, who really believed that America was the New Jerusalem and that God had chosen them and given them America to create a new promised
City
land,
on a
right?
hill.
City on the hill. That's right. And there's a part of that you could argue is can be benign, particularly if it inspires you to like want to do good. I saw your reaction. I think the reality, and this is what is much more common, is it leads to this kind of American exceptionalism. We're better than everyone else. God has chosen us, which can also lead to another myth that we are an innocent nation. Because if God chose us, then maybe we can do no wrong, right? That's
Right.
kind of the extension of it. Another myth that is still quite prevalent is the myth that we are a Christian nation.
Yeah.
And not just that the founders were predominantly Christian, but there's this kind of rewriting of history, revisionist history, that is really taken hold that basically is arguing that the founders actually wanted the country to be a Christian nation. And the the real irony of that is that we have lots of historical evidence of why the founders put in place the First Amendment that enshrines a commitment to no established religion and to religious freedom, right? That was a major kind of revolutionary commitment that I actually think is one of the kind of things that do make us unique as a nation that we should cherish. And yet that is being kind of ignored and undermined by the current Christian nationalist movement. So the reason I'm naming these different myths is they become on-ramps in the
Yeah.
more pernicious form of Christian nationalism. And that more pernicious form gets to a place where it then argues, well, if we're a Christian nation and we're a chosen nation, then the real Americans are European white Americans. And the real Christians that we're trying to, you know, impose their faith on the rest of the country using the power of the state, that's the other critical piece of this,
Yes.
is this very narrow brand of right-wing evangelicalism in particular, or in some
Indeed.
cases, a kind of new apostolic faith or charismatic movement. And so it then, makes everyone else less American. It makes everyone else the potential victim of violations of religious freedom. And it really defies our commitment to religious pluralism as a nation. And
Right.
so that is kind of what we're up against. And again, there's, different degrees of it. But, there's been some great research by Robbie Jones and PRI, which is a research and polling organization. And they have been studying Christian nationalism for a long time. And what they found is that people that strongly identify with Christian nationalism are also much more likely to be supportive of political violence or
Indeed.
to pursue their ends. they're much more likely to be highly racist, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-Semitic. I mean, it is highly correlated with all of these other things
Yep.
that we know are very toxic for our politics and are very contrary to what I believe the Christian faith would call us to stand for and to advocate for. And so because of that, it really is something that is a kind of real challenge, a real enemy to our
Yeah.
Christian witness, and it is one of the strongest forces that is, propping up the current president and
Indeed.
his regime. So I think part of the antidotes to all this is really getting back to some of the core principles, both and basics in terms of our nation's founding and its early history, and getting out into the core principles of our Christian faith that we talked about earlier.
Right.
You know, I think a lot of Christians, that understandably so, love to quote John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son," right? Well, that's the whole world. It does not say United States of America. It says the
Indeed.
whole world. And so, that in itself should force us to resist Christian nationalism that says we should only be thinking about and caring about our own nation, often at the expense of the rest of the world. And just for the sake of time, I won't go through like all the different arguments that we can use to kind of knock down the tenets of Christian nationalism. But there's been some really, really good writing on this, and there's some really good initiatives on this. I'd recommend you check out Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is an initiative of the Baptist Joint Committee.
Yeah.
Um, Jim wrote a book that's very much focused on this.
Yeah.
I have a number of articles that I've written over the years, and so we're definitely trying to raise awareness, but it can be kind of a hard to pinpoint uh, crisis that's happening within our body politic and our church. And last thing I'll say really quickly is I think that the more secular left has kind of been asleep at the wheel as
Right.
this movement really came into power. And it's really important that they understand I don't think you can counteract and defeat Christian nationalism politically without, at least in part, having a strong counter religious narrative,
Yeah.
right? And so that then requires more of the left
It's
to,
up to us.
yeah, but to see a positive role for faith, right?
Right.
And a lot of Democrats have ceded their faith to the other side. They don't like to
Indeed.
talk about it. They don't want to, embrace their faith or kind of, talk about their faith story. And I'm not saying that they should therefore copy the right and do it in a very sectarian way. But I think there's a way that you can authentically talk about your faith in ways that resonate with people of many different faith traditions and of no faith tradition.
You're already answering what was going to be my final question, but I'll just put it out there explicitly, which is in your article, your recent article, Celebrating America Without Losing Our Soul, you you said that the 250th anniversary should be a glimpse of what America could be. And I think you're beginning right now to give us a glimpse of what America could be. How else would you fill that in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna tell a really quick story because it's one of my favorites that I uncovered when I was doing my research for my book, A More Perfect Union. So we all know probably the phrase "A More Perfect Union" comes from the preamble of the Constitution. Arguably the most iconic words. But I won't do a survey on this Zoom call, but I would be surprised if any of you could tell me who actually penned those words originally, like who created that phrase. And, I'm a big Hamilton fan, in terms of the musical, which really helped to popularize Hamilton.
Yes.
I feel like we need a musical to get this person back on the map, but his name is Gouverneur Morris. He was a state assemblyman from the state of New York, and he got entrusted to lead what was called the Committee of Style. It was like the first communications consultant of the United States. And that committee literally helped to pen the preamble of the Constitution. And they wrote it very intentionally because they knew that you had three disparate colonies that were fighting over all these different issues. And they needed some language that would kind of rise above that and unite them based on some shared kind of moral commitments, right? And aspirations. And so that's where we get a more perfect union in order to, well, we the people in order to form a more perfect union. The reason I'm saying that is that I think the deeper story of America that actually counteracts the kind of ahistorical Make America Great Again story is one in which we say, we as a nation have always been about a journey. We have been a project of democracy that has been on a journey through a lot of struggle to expand who is included in We the People and to make real the promise of liberty and justice for all, right? Those are some ideals that are really worth celebrating across red, blue, Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. Like we all have a stake in that, right? And that the kind of shared journey that we are on is not about self-loathing, but it's also not about denying or erasing the harder parts, the uglier parts of our history. We have to reckon with that in order, again, the truth will set you free. Like that truth is something that will ultimately enable us to expand freedom and expand opportunity and liberty for everyone. And that this goes back a little bit to my vision of the beloved community. I do believe we need an overarching, unifying moral vision, and we don't all have to use the exact same language per se. But the best language I can come up with is the beloved community. And for me, the beloved community is building a nation where neither punishment nor privilege is tied to our race or ethnicity or gender or ableness or sexual orientation. And I shared this other part earlier, but it's to build a nation where everyone is equally respected and valued, where our growing diversity is seen as a strength and not a weakness, and where everyone is able to thrive. And I believe deeply that the vast, vast majority of Americans would actually embrace that, that would
Yeah.
resonate with them, right? And again, we're going to disagree on how we get there, but we need to get to that conversation
Yes.
rather than like
Not the
being,
one we're currently having.
embroiled in what we're currently dealing with. And we can't even get to that conversation, let alone potentially creating a kind of new founding of our country or a new reconstruction of our
Yeah.
country if we don't figure out how to get through this authoritarian consolidation spiral that we're in right now. And
Yeah.
I really believe that's how dangerous this current moment is. I actually do believe that this administration is weaker than it looks and has overreached a
Yep.
huge degree. And, you know, and at the same time, the administration and Trump in particular is going to be willing to do whatever it takes to hold on to power,
Exactly.
right? And we would be really, really foolhardy not to take that danger seriously. And so
Yeah.
I'll just name like a very concrete opportunity I'd love to invite you into. Um, one of the initiatives that I'm most proud of right now with Sojourners is called Faiths United to Save Democracy. And it's an umbrella campaign that we co-created with the Skinner Leadership Institute and with Jim's new outfit at Georgetown, which is the Georgetown Center for Faith and Justice.
Yep.
We created it after the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Holder versus Shelby County, where the Supreme Court basically started to gut the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, and removed the pre-clearance provision that had been forcing states to pre-clear any changes to their voting laws with the Supreme Court. Sorry, with the Justice Department. We
Yeah.
knew when the Supreme Court removed that pre-clearance provision that there would be a barrage of new restrictions and laws all across the South and in some cases the Midwest and other places. They would be targeting Black and brown voters in particular to make it more difficult for them to vote. And that's exactly what has happened in the last, 15 plus years since
Right.
that decision came down. And so, and then, now to make things even worse, we saw the Cali decision, Cali versus Louisiana, that fully gutted the Voting Rights Act and has now made it possible for, pretty much any state to fully racially gerrymander their maps as long as they call them partisan or they're doing it for partisan reason. And of course, we
Right.
know that, so often partisanship and our kind of racial history and racial realities today are very much overlapping. And so, um, what we're doing through this campaign is we are engaging in voter education in 9 key battleground states. We're also equipping and training clergy, but not just clergy, just anyone that's kind of a leader within their church to be a poll chaplain or a peacekeeper on election day to provide a moral presence to try to deter harassment, intimidation, and violence, and to try to de-escalate any kind of conflict that might
Right.
arise. We've been doing this for 4 election cycles. We've really strengthened the program over time. And our goal is to deploy 2,000 poll chaplains and peacekeepers in Virginia. So if you're in DC, very close to you, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, Wisconsin, Arizona, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and I always forget one or two. But the key here, and I'll put this in the chat, is you can go to turnoutsunday.com and you can both learn more about the campaign, but you can also sign up for one of our virtual trainings. All you have to do to become a poll chaplain or peacekeeper is, kind of go through an hour and a half online
Yep.
training. And the next one is going to be on September 28th. So we're really trying to
Woohoo.
drive as many people as possible to sign up. We've got about 500 right now, and we're determined to get beyond 2,000 because there's just
Super.
there's a lot of need. So that's kind of a concrete way that you can help protect everyone's sacred right to vote. And the last thing I'll just mention is that, and I'll put this in the chat too, but we also developed a toolkit that's around trying to mobilize faith leaders to prevent any form of election subversion. So this is like looking at all of the kind of machinations of this administration to block the vote count or maybe
Yes.
deploy ICE or potentially the National Guard declaring a national emergency or confiscating voting machines. I won't go through the whole laundry list, but there are all these different scenarios that
Yep.
we know could undermine this next election. And so we're getting ready and we're going to have faith leaders ready to respond.
Thank God for doing that work and for anticipating the challenges that are only going to increase over the next 98 days until the election. I know we have a number of questions that have been put into the chat, and I'm not sure who I turn it over to handle those questions. Who's doing the questions?
It's me, Jim. It's Ace,
Okay, Ace, take it
along with
away.
Martin. And thank you so much, Jim, for the questions you've asked and the wonderful, wonderful conversation Adam, you and Jim have just engaged in front of all us as your witnesses. We really appreciate it. And you have gotten some really good questions. So we'll start. But let me just say at the very beginning, I think, Adam, your ability to give us the information, everyone in the chat, especially for the protected democracy that you have just given us. Turnoutsunday.com, everyone. Turnoutsunday.com. Easy, quick. We should be able to remember that and tune in, because the conversation is also weighted with this notion that we've got to do something, right? We can't just sit back. We can't just listen to conversations and feel good that we're here tonight. We have to take it and activate it. And so your suggestion for turnoutsunday.com is just really timely and important. So thank you for that. And now Martin and I will go back and forth, and I get to ask you the first one. The first question: how do we deal with the authoritarian leaning for a large number of evangelicals who see voter protection as a left-wing campaign, and so not to be taken seriously?
It's a really good question, and it's a tough one. I mean, so our campaign really starts theologically. So we really emphasize what I started this conversation with, which is Genesis 1:6, that we are made in the image of God. And so we start there because we believe if you believe that everyone's made in the image and likeness of God, then any effort to try to deny someone's ability to vote or to try to deter them from voting ultimately becomes an assault on Imago Dei itself. And so it gets protecting everyone's freedom to vote out of this purely political frame or ideological frame into a deeply spiritual, theological frame. And I'm not saying that works for everyone. It's not going to convince every evangelical, but I think for a lot of them, like they do want to be supporting people's dignity. And so I think that has been a an effective bridge building argument for some evangelicals that we've been able to work with and kind of sway over.
Hmm.
I think the other is that, unfortunately, there's this kind of ends justify the means thinking that is also happening in many evangelical circles, where, if we are, in their language, engaged in spiritual warfare, and the other side is evil, that then justifies me engaging in things that I know are wrong, and even potentially supporting people that I know are bad people that are doing bad things. But that is justified. That is, yeah, essentially justified if ultimately, like, they're standing on the side of good, right? Or ultimately, helping to, in their estimation, support good. And I think that whole kind of logic is very, very flawed, right? And there's ways in which we need to kind of help people understand just how dangerous that can be in terms of where you take that to its conclusion. Um, we have been able to work with some evangelical churches in this work. I mean, just being honest, we've got a lot more traction among Catholic sisters and Catholic churches, among mainline Protestants of all different traditions, and certainly among the Black church and some Latino churches. And so I'm saying that not because by any means am I giving up on our evangelical brothers and sisters or siblings, but it has been harder, particularly among many of the more conservative ones. And this is where I think we have to be real about it. Like, within some evangelical circles, faith has become much more synonymous with ideology and party loyalty than it does to the core teaching of Jesus Christ. And, I'm not one to judge someone's heart. I can't, say whether someone's authentic in their faith or not. But what I can say is, do I think what they're doing is consistent with the core teachings of Jesus Christ? And I really, believe strongly that many of them are not. And, you even look at some of the polling. There's been, some of the bigger denominations like the Southern Baptists have actually been losing membership, but they haven't been losing it at quite as fast, because there's a number of people that are becoming evangelical because they identify that with the Trump movement. They identify it with Trump. And yet, if you ask them, are you involved in the evangelical church? Well, no. Do you understand some of the core teachings of what it means to be an evangelical? No. And so, again, this is much more of a political movement than it is a deeply rooted theological movement. And that's where, I think it then becomes a real danger to the witness of the church itself and to the kind of reputation of the church. So, those are some of my thoughts. I still believe that there are many evangelicals that also are deeply concerned about the direction of the country and the state of the church itself. I wish more of them were more vocal, but hoping that will happen.
Thank you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I've really appreciated this conversation, and what you just said is a perfect segue into my question, or bunch of questions. But first, I want to note for folks that you have made an offer in the chat of a special deal on subscription to Sojourner magazine. So folks, go there into the chat. There's a link. And then there's also an article that you recommended to us linked there, and an action guide on election subversion. So really appreciate that. But let's talk for a minute about facts and ideology. I might have misunderstood you, but I thought at first you said facts don't win the argument, that facts don't change minds, that ideology is really more influential. But then you kind of went back and said, well, we have to open our minds to facts, and suggesting others do too. And so part of my question is, did I misunderstand you? How do you square that? But also, how do we open our own ideologies to be open to the facts? How do we help other people do that? And in particular, what do we do when someone just outright, refuses to accept something that is an undeniable fact? Can you really change? And I guess the last part of this is, I wonder whether people's stated faith really drives their voting versus other ideologies like racism or, an exploitative mindset or things like that.
Yep. All right, those are good ones. Well, it's good. It gives me a chance to clarify a little bit. So, from a persuasion communication point of view, I don't think we can lead with facts. And that doesn't mean that facts shouldn't be a part of the equation at all. But I think everything that I've read, particularly in the last number of years, from kind of cognitive scientists to communication specialists, is that, people are really moved by story and they're moved by their values and they're moved by, people that can kind of help them make sense of the world. And, facts alone don't do that. That being said, I want to rebuild together a culture and kind of political system or polity where facts again do matter, and that we have some really trusted sources that can act as kind of a referee in our politics to be able to tell us what works and what doesn't. And we still have this in some ways. I mean, as much as the Trump administration has tried to undermine and dismantle a lot of the places that we still get some facts, we still, get job numbers from the Labor Department, and some of them should have an asterisk next to them. But there are some kind of core facts that we still kind of rely on as a barometer of how we're doing in our economy, et cetera. Um, I think there are certain facts that are tied to people's lived experience that even this administration and this president is finding it more and more difficult to bend to his reality. He's lying constantly about the state of the economy, including inflation. And yet people are going to the grocery store and they are paying out the wazoo and they are seeing the degree to which inflation is very much real, right? And that is creating some real tension, I think, among some parts of his base. Um, so I think there's examples like that where it's like, people's lived experience is probably going to be more important than even them trusting someone that they voted for, like Trump. And again, that's not all, obviously, but I think that that's enough. That's part of the reason why Trump's popularity is plummeted to kind of record lows when you look at most of the polls now. I think that there's a certain segment of the population, and I don't know the exact numbers, but maybe it's about 20%, where Trump is almost like a cult of personality. And I don't know how to break through with that, whether it's with facts or with stories or with, and I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's extremely, extremely hard. That's the bad news. The good news is there's another, 10 to 20% that I think are really starting to second guess and have misgivings and are reachable. And they're not going to join the Democratic Party. They're not going to join the progressive movement, but they could really defect from supporting the Trump regime. And those are the folks that we do need to persuade if we can, and reach if we can, and be in conversation with if we can. And many of them are in our neighborhoods, churches, workplaces, et cetera. So I do have a lot of hope for those folks. And again, I'm not saying that this to write off anyone. I believe that anyone's heart can be changed. Um, but at the same time, I'm also pragmatic. And I do think there's some folks that were just like, they're just such in their echo chamber, and they're so like kind of just beholden to this, Trump movement and kind of cult of personality. I don't really know how to change their minds.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you.
really appreciate your honesty about how hard this work is. I think that's, we all have to face that in order to keep going. There's no easy out here. We are running out of time, unfortunately, and I have two questions that I really would love to get your take
Right.
on. So maybe if you just briefly answer both of them, I
Okay.
snuck in two. And the first
Yeah.
one is, you did share with us, and your last comment was kind of going in this direction anyways, but I'd like to get a little bit more concrete, I guess, if possible. What does love our enemy look like for you? You said there were two, the golden rule and love our enemy. And every
Yeah.
time I hear that, I'm in wonder of how that can happen. What does it take, not in the enemy, but in yourself to be able to reach out to your enemy?
Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, one component or dimension of it is, and this is another kind of spiritual practice, and I think call in scripture is to pray for our elected officials. And I do. I mean, I pray for President Trump. I pray for Speaker Johnson. I pray for Senator Thune. And it's not always easy. I mean, it's not always because I want to, right? It's because I believe it's important and I feel compelled to do it from a spiritual discipline point of view. Um, I also just really try to resist in my own heart and mind kind of demonizing or villainizing those that are ardent supporters of the MAGA movement or in the Christian nationalist movement. And it's not at all to like excuse the impact of their political decisions or on the things that they may be saying and doing. But it is, this kind of strong spiritual discipline to, resist showing contempt for them because they're also made in the image of God, right? And, you know, I think it's really important that we distinguish between what it means to electorally defeat that movement, which I think is really, really important to do, and then with like trying to defeat them as people, right? Or to punish them or to, be vindictive in, what we try to carry out. And again, we're seeing this with this administration. I mean, it's the most punitive, vindictive administration we have had in our nation's history. So those are some examples, I would say.
Oh, beautiful. The discipline, the spiritual discipline, and to defeat the movement, but not the people or the person, I think and you have to practice it, right? It's
Yeah.
not just something I think most of us come to naturally. The last from me, and then Martin will get one more, and then we'll move on. So, my last question for you is sort of along the same line, I think, but I did hear you say, you want to push us. Jim asked you about a vision for America, and you said push us in a different trajectory. And you then said work with state and local officials. I think I heard you say that. So, we also urge our members to get out there in the streets and make good trouble, as they love to say. So, what would you say is important about reaching out to and if you do get your officials on the phone or in the office, what might you offer them as counsel?
Yeah, well, I'm just encouraging you to build relationships of accountability with officials at every level, if you can, from local, state, all the way up to the federal level. And, what I try to do is be a combination of pastoral and prophetic. So pastoral in the sense of like, really listening to, some of their own struggles and reminding them of some of the convictions that they came into office with, if you know what those are. Um, Showing care toward them because it's not an easy job, particularly given the state of our politics right now. And, know when it's important to be prophetic, to speak truth to power, to remind them of the consequences of their decision, who their decisions are hurting, who they're leaving out, right? And so that's kind of the approach that we have taken. And, we often offer to pray for the politicians and their staff that we meet with. And it is exceedingly rare that they decline our offer. Like they really welcome it and appreciate it.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay, last question. It's probably way too big, but I'm thinking back to your comment about there being evangelicals in the middle who are beginning to question, and it just raises a question that I have all the time, which is there a tension between reaching to the middle and motivating the base?
Mm.
And, can we do both? And if not, which way ought we to focus?
It's a great question. So I am reminded of 1 Corinthians 12, where the Apostle Paul says that we are one body with many parts and that we have different spiritual gifts, right? I think that's true in movements as well. So I'm going to share a kind of framework that you may have heard of called the 3 Bs. So it's blocking, building, and bridging. And the blocking is like the resistance work, it's the protest work, it's the advocacy activism work that needs to be done, particularly to protect the most vulnerable in this time, but also to protect our fragile democratic system and values. The bridging is some of that persuasion work, right? Reaching to some of the middle, trying to engage in dialogue, right? And then the building is a combination of like building stronger movement infrastructure, but also casting the vision for the alternate that we're trying to build together, that we're trying to reach toward. And I'm naming that because I actually think that we need all three. And each of us is going to be called and gifted differently in those three different buckets. And it's not to say that you then just choose one and only do that one. But I do think that there may be a way in which you are more gifted and called to focus on blocking or bridging or building. And again, I think that we really do need a combination of these three, commitments in order to not only kind of defeat the current authoritarian threat, but ultimately help us get to the beloved community.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
It's really wonderful. I get the privilege of thanking you for such inspiring ideas, such beautiful articulation of where we need to go. And it is a really big help for us to keep going on this work in the next, not just the midterms, but then after the midterms, we'll still be out there. We'll still be praying, thinking, building, bridging, blocking, but the other way, maybe blocking, whatever it is. I'm a little dyslexic, so I just went there. But anyways, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And for the rest of you, if you just stay on, you're welcome to stay with us, Adam, but we just have a few ending matters that we're going to share.
Yeah, no, I'm going to step off, but thank you all. It's so good to be with you.
Thank you
Great
so
to be with
much.
you, Adam. Thank you.
Yep. Bye-bye.
And I would also be remiss if we did not thank Jim for a beautiful series of questions, and your interview, as always, is so flawless. Thank you very, very much. So Kathleen, this is the time to put in the chat. We have a lot of really great information in the chat for those of you who are still on the screen. We still have you. And of course, those who will listen in afterwards, this is for you as well. They get the chat too, Kathleen, right? Those who were not here tonight, they can see it because there's some amazing and Kathleen, everybody who is our facilitator, is just magic with links. So there they all are for you. And the one she just put up, I believe, is something called the covenant for our future. So I want to spend whatever time we have left, which isn't much, to explain that to you. The next one she put on, though, just so you see it, is the very good and the very bad, which happens to be an interview by Ezra Klein, the podcaster, with Bill McKibben, who, of course, we all know as one of the founders of Third Act. And Bill is doing a really great job of kind of carrying us through the map of where we are precisely, not just in the USA, but around the world right now in climate. And it's a very encouraging and very information-full facts, as our friend Adams said to us. So that's just for you to enjoy. But Covenant for Our Future is something that Third Act Faith is working on very closely with Green Faith. And let me just explain what this Covenant for the Future is and what you can do with that link. So if you don't want to click on it right now, which you probably should listen to me for a minute first, take it with you, Covenant for the Future. So we're calling for the repeal of HR 1, which is known by some of us as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or for other us, the One Big Barbecue Act. And that HR 1, which is a federal, of course, bill that we're calling to repeal, is a renewal of the federal government's commitment to justice. We want to sign this covenant for the future to renew our work on behalf of a commitment to justice. This is our moment to act with the conviction that a just and equitable future is possible. This is very much in line with what you just heard tonight from Jim and from Adam. It's an opportunity for faith communities and our leaders across the country to renew hope, reclaim agency, and reignite belief. Our call is clear. We're calling upon legislators, policymakers, and candidates to repeal this really immoral law and replace it with legislation that reflects our shared values. What are some of them? Feeding the hungry, healing the sick, protecting the environment, and treating migrants with dignity. Your signature, each of you can do this. With that link, you will go to the website of the Covenant for the Future, and you will be invited to click and sign on individually to show your support of this campaign. Your signature strengthens our multi-faith campaign to raise awareness, shift public understanding, erode the legitimacy of harmful policies, and shape the moral narrative for 2026 and beyond. So this is what Third Act Faith tonight asks of you as an action item. And as you will see, if you go to their website, the Covenant for Our Future, you will see plenty of information about what's happening, places and ways that you could get involved. In particular, the last week of August is a week of action to speak up to try to repeal H.R. 1. Now, we know that that is not going to happen anytime soon, but to educate many of our voters on what that's about and what it has done to hurt our the people most in need in this country, I think it will be a good way to get people out there talking and motivating us and activating us. So with that, I believe oh, yes, one last point. Next time, our next meeting is August 25th, and it will be 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. I just revealed my New York prejudice. 7 p.m. Eastern time. That is when we always meet, usually the fourth Tuesday, and the next one is August 25th. And our speaker in this series of how to do our spiritual commitments and how that influences our voting patterns, our speaker promises to be also very interesting. Will Howard, who is head of Insights and Advisory Services for Potential Energy Coalition. What is that? He will share the results of their extensive research on effective climate-related messaging, which obviously we need very much, as Adam had just said. How do you message, the good news for people in a way that they will wrap themselves around? So this nonprofit Potential Energy Coalition uses rigorous data-driven approaches to test and hone in effective messages around climate change and climate solutions. So join us for that evening. Again, it is August 25th, 4 p.m. On the West Coast, 7 p.m. Eastern, and in the middle of the country, I think you know what time it'll be for yourselves. That's too much for me right now. I now want to turn it back, I believe, to Kathleen to wish us all a good night with the best possible music to lighten our, and thank you all for coming.
There you go. Thanks, Ace and Jim and Adam and Martin and everyone else who helped. The last song of the night is one that'll get your feet tapping. One of my favorite musicians, Bette Midler, with All You Fascists Bound to Lose. Here we go.
Let me
There you
put
go.
you straight. When you come for the rest of us, we'll fight you at the gate and you will lose. You fascists bound to lose. We'll battleize together until they cut and run, just like in Minneapolis. And when the midterms come, you're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. Oh, you fascists bound to lose. Oh, you fascists bound to lose. I said, oh, you fascists bound to lose. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose. To hell with all the cowards who hide behind their masks. We're gonna win the midterms. We're coming for his ass. He knows it too. That bastard's bound to lose.
Good night, everyone. Thanks. That was great, Kathleen.